Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. I'm Gary Pollan.
And I'm Dallas Jones.
This week on Red, White, and Blue, the border and the immigration crisis. And if it seems like we've been talking about this for a number of years, that's because we have. This week we have three guests who are going to give us some insight on how did we end up where we are today and where are we going, and can we ever solve this immigration crisis that seems to never end. First, Magali Suárez Candler, a lawyer in her own law firm. Thank you. Next, Charles Foster, who's the chairman of Foster LLP, and Charles has been active and known Charles Foster forever. You've been a board-certified immigration lawyer probably for 60, 70, maybe more years. And finally, well, we're getting old. Finally, Geoffrey Hoffman, director of the U of H Immigration Clinic. Welcome to all three of you. And Charles, I want to start with you. In 1986, Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill, they came together, Democrats and Republicans, in a bipartisan way and passed an immigration reform bill that everybody told us was going to solve the problem, and it was going to take care of the people that are in the country in the shadows, which nobody wants to see, was going to get control of the borders, was going to strengthen the legal immigration system, and we'd never have to worry about it again. So what happened?
I think it was a good piece of legislation. I'll surprise you. Ron Mazzoli, a congressman from Kentucky, worked with Al Simpson, a great Republican. He should have been vice president with George H.W. Bush. But he told me, he said, Charles, when we pass this, we'll not have one more undocumented alien, because we were going to give legal status, legalized, direct. That was a direct pathway to citizenship, direct pathway to green card status. And for the first time, employers could not hire U.S. workers. They had to, they could not hire unauthorized workers. They had to verify that they were authorized to work. So when I hear that that was a failure, I actually testified on that. Once you decided that an employer had to verify who was authorized to work, how were you going to do that? Was it based upon your appearance or your language skills? No. So the go-to document was going to be the U.S. Social Security card. Congress was not going to authorize an internal ID card, so it was a Social Security card. So I testified saying that it had to be upgraded. Lloyd Benson supported that, had to be upgraded and so that you couldn't copy it. The copies in any flea market were better than the ones being issued today by Social Security. Think about it. Your passport's been completely updated. It's a technological wonder. Your driver's license, Social Security card, same as it was printed in 1934. The second problem, in a meeting, Reagan, when pushed on that, said, the next thing you guys would want is for us to tattoo the Social Security number on the wrist of every little baby. He was pushing back. The second thing, and I'll stop here, we needed a viable guest workers program so that people where there were proven shortage of U.S. workers, they could come in and work. So I think if we had handled those two problems, it would have been more successful.
Well, it's interesting. Y'all were talking about this bill in 1986. I was 6 years old. So I can't say I vividly remember when it was signed. So all of these things we understand. Where we are today, right? I think we saw recently within the last 24 hours that there's been a ban on President Trump's immigration policy that would protect residents from 4 countries. He's taken some hard blows, Gary, in terms of some of his immigration policies that he's been pushing forward since taking office. I'd be curious about some of you all's thoughts, considering that where we are now is still the same party of Ronald Reagan that is governing. What are your thoughts on some of the immigration policies that have come out of this White House?
I'd like to speak to that just briefly. The Trump administration obviously has changed the landscape of immigration law, I think in ways that sometimes the public doesn't fully appreciate. There's been incremental changes and not so incremental changes, right? So you've had the rescission of DACA, or the attempted rescission of DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals, the attempted termination of TPS, temporary protected status. You've had the travel ban, so-called Muslim ban. You've had a whole range of different efforts on the part of this administration to really revamp immigration enforcement. And I think one of the things I'd like to point out, and maybe we could discuss, is how the federal courts have become the locus of power in terms of scaling back or reining in the Trump administration. And that's something that we really haven't seen before.
Yeah, well, that is true, and there have been a lot of things done, which goes back to what Charles and I were talking about, the symptom of the problem. We haven't done any fundamental reforms. The 86 reforms failed because, and you're right, no guest workers, and really the border protection was a joke too. So we basically restaged. So here's a question for you to think about. Okay, we understand we've been talking about this forever and ever. Things don't seem to move, and so what we deal with symptoms. So we have kids who are brought here by their parents or relatives or whoever, innocent, went through our schools, learned English or law-abiding. What do we do about them? But that becomes a symptom of the overall problem. So we could solve that problem, but then we create all these other new problems. But anyway, I was interested in your take.
Well, my take is that they did try to reform in '96, and that didn't really help very much. In fact, they made things worse. So there was an attempt to fix it, and they said that was comprehensive. As far as the children, I mean, one thing I just want to throw out there too is that we've got an invisible wall. That's what we've been calling it, because we're talking about all the things that everybody sees, but what we see behind the scenes is that they're making everything more difficult. They're questioning every single application, even for professionals. So the public charge, they're making anybody, they're worrying that everybody's going to be a public charge even more than they used to. People are worrying about getting food for their children. Sometimes food stamps and WIC for their children who are U.S. citizens.
Public charge has traditionally been part of American immigration. When my great-grandfather came over, when he came over, and he came into New York, Ellis Island, he couldn't get in the country unless relatives signed on who said, we will make sure he is never a public charge, and you have to agree never to apply. And thank God for him, the relatives said they would, because I guess they could have said no. They would have said, okay, back to the old country.
Well, they've got a contract now. It's a contract. It's good for 10 years or until they become citizens. And now the administration's saying that's not enough. Let's look behind it. Who is that that's saying that they're going to give you money? So we're really seeing, again, behind the scenes, what no one else sees other than those who are going through it and those who are practicing. They're just trying to make it more difficult now.
You practice immigration law on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I do. I'm board certified. I've done it for almost 29
not
years.
Before him.
Not before him. I used to be his partner. We were partners.
Oh,
I was
really?
with Charles for almost 15 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Let me make a couple of comments. In addition to the 96 Act, the big, I worked for, when then Governor candidate George W. Bush decided to run, I was asked to be his policy advisor, and he could not have been, Dallas, forgive me, but he's a Republican, but he could not have been stronger on immigration reform. He had a big comprehensive immigration bill. We worked out, I would say, the basic frameworks of comprehensive reform. We were going to pass that. The president was going to pass that. It was very heady. On the morning of September 7th, 2001, Vincente Fox was on the White House grounds, the president. We were all geared up. I was supposed to speak on the morning of 9/11 with his domestic policy advisor. But what really happened to comprehensive immigration reform was 9/11, and after that, the what I would call the big anti-restrictionists who they were focused on impact on employment. They now had national security, and that's been our bane ever since, trying to pass anything. I'd like to pick up on one more thing they said. When President Trump ran, we all knew that he was going to be extraordinarily hard, tough, build a wall. At one point, he was going to deport all 11 million. He backed off of that.
I think it's more than 12 million now, actually.
The number is, depending on who you listen to, it can be higher. But here's the point I'd like to make. What people do not realize that they've commented on, he has been tougher on legal immigration. The idea that illegal is bad, we love legal. This White House has been the toughest on legal immigration. They've cut back every way. Stephen Miller in the White House, I think, is the force behind this. He's not going to. We came close to having a solution for the DACA beneficiaries.
Right.
The president was going to get his $25 million for the wall, but he was told, you can't sign that, Mr. President, because your base won't allow it. So I don't know how we're going to get over this.
Well, I mean, one thing may be to rise above partisanship and talk about what's good for the country. I mean, if you can sell the American people on immigration reform as being good for people that are already here, then I think that you'd be okay. But there are things that are going on, and part of it is the broad brush.
You know, surprisingly, Gary, you said what I was going to, which is that I think
Great
at
minds
what point do we begin to put people over our politics and over our partisanship, and you know, particularly around the issue of DACA. You know, when I first learned about this, and certainly I don't practice immigration work as much as you all do, but when the idea of someone, you know, bringing over a 2-year-old that has lived here for 30, 40 years and built a family, and has, you know, children that are born American being taken to a place that they've never known, you know, I just don't see us as looking at people. And so, you know, what I would say is how do you think we began to create a dialogue that will kind of tone down what's happening, and how do we get to what's a real solution for the people that need it the most? How do we get there?
Education. Education, let them know how difficult it is to become a permanent resident in the United States. People don't think that. Everybody says, why aren't they doing it the right way? Why aren't they getting in line? We need to create that line for them.
Well, and I think, to building on that, I think that there's a range of different options that are available, legal options for people who are undocumented. And I think in the public, there's this very black and white sort of misunderstanding that you have legal and illegal aliens, right? You hear about the illegal aliens. And so there are actually people who could have overstayed their visa. It's not a criminal offense to merely overstay a visa. In fact, there may be a range of different options available: asylum, adjustment of status, cancellation of removal, et cetera, that if they had appropriate representation, maybe the majority of those people could adjust their status and somehow come out of the shadows and do it under the existing law, under the law we have right now.
I differ a little bit. I agree along the margins. There are things that can be done, and everyone should, pardon the advertisement, but everyone should consult an attorney because there are issues. But I think overall, the real problem, as Magali references, we have an extremely restrictive legal system. So when people say go back and get in line and you can come in legally, there is no line. If they go back, most of them will be subject to a 10-year prohibition. They will not have the family sponsorship. They will not have an immediate relative or an employer willing to sponsor them. So you take the DACA beneficiaries. Everyone's sympathetic. Everyone wants to do something for them. But sooner or later, the court protection will come to an end, and on that day, every one of them will immediately become subject to removal from the United States, and the vast majority will have no legal option. And under the Trump administration, ICE is to make no exception. So if they encounter someone like that, they will be put into removal proceedings and deported. So we need legislation is the answer.
And so let me throw out a few ideas.
I agree.
Let me throw out a few ideas of things that could be a step-by-step process for reform.
Okay.
First, we should welcome lawful immigrants.
True.
Especially those who bring a lot to the country, okay? We should also welcome guest workers and have a formalized system for that so we can take people out of the shadows. We need to encourage those who come and live in America to fully participate in American life. Learn what it means to be an American, what our American culture is, which, by the way, they add to when they come. Because our culture changes as our country changes, but I think it's all good. I mean, I like El Salvadoran restaurants. I like the best. I think it helps us. Learning English, because learning English is the key to being successful in America. Expanding opportunities, which everyone should be for. And then we need to prevent unlawful immigration and closing the door once and for all. And part of that's education. But along with that, we have responsibility to help the countries that are close to us that are causing this refugee problem to eliminate. In El Salvador and Honduras, it's the runaway gangs and the threats that happen and the shootings and the killings, the drug cartel. That is part of the problem, why people run, because America, even though we're not as safe as we'd like to be, like Chicago where they have all the murders, it's still a whole lot safer than those countries. Sure. We need to encourage respect for the law. We need to secure the border, and we need to preserve American sovereignty. And if we can come up with a comprehensive plan that does that, then we know what we need to do is to fix the dreamers. They're law-abiding, they stay. That's it. They can stay. Now, whether chain migration continues, I'm generally not in favor of it. I think it should be done on merit. But I'm concerned. Now, there are dreamers in the country like the guy who killed Kate Steinle. He was a dreamer. He came back in the country 3 or 4 times illegally after he was deported. And he killed her. And those are the kind of people who want to get
I
rid
don't
of
think
them.
he's a dreamer. I would disagree with that. I think you're using dreamer in a.
We don't want it here.
And you know, Gary,
Those
yeah,
I was with illegals, we don't want.
I was with you until you said that.
And I do like Kate's law.
And the thing is, you know, every time that argument is made, I cringe because Americans kill people. Right here in America. And so to categorize and say, well, because XYZ happened because they weren't from this country.
But not only that, dreamers have to pass background checks and cannot have a significant misdemeanor.
Right.
So it's important
there are
to use the
people within that
language correctly.
definition
And I would also
of coming in as children that are committing felonies and need to be deported.
And on your list,
That's
the
all.
only other thing I kind of take issue with is,
Respect
this
for
is
the
a
law.
country. This is a country that was built on immigration. It's meant to be this destination of the promised land. I don't think you have to speak English in order to be a good American
we can
citizen.
disagree on that one.
Right? I think it's probably more helpful to you.
Well, for naturalization, you have to pass an English
Right.
test.
All right, so let me one of the things we haven't talked about, and I want to, well, all of you deal with clients. What we don't hear, or we don't know the stories of the people who have come here, the kids who have come here. I've actually been appointed by the courts to represent some of the kids who are trying to, I guess they're abandoned and then they're allowed to stay in the country. That's the bottom line. I actually had one case where the judge challenged, and I was the ad litem, I looked into it, and the kid was from El Salvador, and the judge had all these questions, one of which was, well, he was living with his grandmother. Why can't he go back to his grandmother? I said, well, that would be because the grandmother is immigrating to America legally. She was on the list for 10 years and she just got accepted. You should have seen the judge's face.
Know
She
what to
goes,
go back to.
wow.
That's good.
So
That's
there's
a good
nobody there.
answer.
It was a good
That
answer.
was a good
And
answer.
it got granted, and the young man got
for
to
you,
stay.
Gary.
You like that?
Thank
Thinking
you.
outside the box.
Special
So,
immigrant
but there are
juveniles,
so many stories like this, and the kids, they're heartbreaking of what, they go back. I had one kid who went back home. He got deported, actually. He was falsely accused of a crime, of sexually assaulting his wife, but she was underage. So he got deported. I couldn't stop it. I tried. And he gets up and goes back to the country, and the only relative he had living was in Mexico. 2 days after he came home, he was killed by the cartel.
Oh,
So he came back illegally, unfortunately. I don't blame him. Anyway, there are so many stories like this.
You said something I'd like to pick up on, and I mean, I agreed with your broad principles. I also agree that learning English it's important, whether it's a legal requirement. It is a legal requirement for citizenship. But you said something else, and I wrote about this recently. We've got a special problem in the Northern Hemisphere. It's not Central Americans, it's 3 countries, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. We spend billions of dollars already on enforcement. If we just spend a portion of that, sort of what I call a muscular Marshall Plan, on helping law enforcement and economic conditions in those 3 countries. We can't do that all around the world, but we have a special relationship with those countries because of their proximity, that we should do that. That would be good for them if people do not leave their home country unless there are significant push factors you alluded to, Gary. And by the way, look at Mexico right now. If you look at the statistics that are thrown out, way down.
Because their economy is doing well.
Yeah, most of the people coming now are from Central America,
Right.
and it's because of the bad conditions there.
That's it. And I think there needs to be more talk about that in a public policy realm by everybody.
I have a go ahead.
I was just going to say, many of them want to apply for asylum, and we're making it extremely difficult to be able to apply for asylum as well now.
And the answer is not the zero tolerance policy that forces children away from their parents. I mean, I just want to say how reprehensible this was. I mean, this is not a legal point, this is a moral point that and I went to Carnes with my clinic, and we saw these fathers and the children. It's just such an incredible situation when you think about children being ripped away from their parents, and then the federal government taking the children and not knowing where they're being sent. I mean, it's just unbelievable to me. So I agree with what Charles is saying, but I think the answer is not family separation. The answer is not zero tolerance.
That's
I
right.
never could have
Family,
been that.
reunite the families in a safe El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala
I have a
with
question
opportunity, economic opportunity.
that I'm interested in. So the New York Times reported that Judge Chin cited comments in the president's speech. This is the judge that overturned this recent case. Judge Chin cited comments in the president's speeches and Twitter's posts as evidence of an animus against non-white, non-European immigrants. he wrote that there was circumstantial evidence of race being a motivating factor. Is race a factor in our immigration policy today? In your opinions?
I don't know that I can really point to it. I personally think that it could be just coincidental that all these people coming from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras are brown-skinned and but it's hard to know, right? I don't know if this were happening from Canada, you know, but I don't know that it's obviously racial.
I think the president's made a number of inflammatory remarks, and that has caused him difficulty with the Muslim ban, and now
this
with
is true,
this,
the
just
Muslim
because of his inability to control his.
And let me say, the rhetoric, in answer to your question, the rhetoric has repercussions, right? So even if you're doing it for political purposes and you're trying to stimulate the base, people who work for the federal government, they hear that, and I think what it does for some of them, there's good people who work for the government, but some of them, I think, feel like their fetters have been removed, and so for the people who want to abuse the system, like with family separation, like with some of the other things we've seen, which are abuses against immigrants, I think that you could say it is racially motivated.
Well, I don't agree, and I will tell you that the problem is that the American public generally, regardless of party, is frustrated and upset with the fact that we have neglected the immigration issue and just not dealt with it. It's kind of like we just stick our head in the sand and say we won't worry about it. And we know, look, I know there are Republicans who like the present system because they like employing undocumented workers because you can exploit them, right? You know, I'm going to quit. No, you're not doing anything, or I'm going to report you and have you deported. That kind of stuff has got to stop, and that's why we didn't. By the way, I think we didn't get a guest worker program.
Well, we see really good employers that can't find workers, and they're trying to do it right.
Right.
And there's no way for the people who are undocumented to get work permits.
And
I know
we
Charles
don't have
sees
a
it too.
program.
I'm sure you were going to mention
And that needs
something
to be,
about that.
That's why
Yes.
these things need to be talked about. And the employers, instead of hiring the people who are illegal, they need to be complaining to the leaders in Washington, hey, we need a guest worker program. We need it yesterday.
But they do. They've been doing it. We've been part of groups that have been lobbying for that.
And they just don't listen to you?
And it doesn't happen. It has not been happening. And we're talking about the employers themselves.
Right.
The business owners going.
it's
It's
unfortunate.
not happening. It's a problem.
I would say this, Gary, and Dallas too, because we're all involved in politics. What has struck me over the years, particularly with our Republican congressional delegation, that there is sort of a broad recognition. Most of them would agree with probably some of the issues we're talking about. Something has to be done. But the fear is, and I won't name names, but they'll say, well, Charles, I learned this years ago. It was very discouraging. So I agree with you 100%, but I can't vote that way because someone's going to primary me on my district, and no matter what I vote for, they will call it amnesty. So that's part of the problem, and that's where you really need leadership in the White House. I actually thought Trump might be able at different times provide that, because if he could support it, then they could go along.
And that may still happen, and maybe in it, we talked about a step-by-step program, and people know where we're going, because otherwise the problem doesn't get better, it just gets worse. It's crazy.
I just want to plug the Rational Middle. It's called the Rational Middle. It's on, you can Google it, and so I think Charles and Gordon Kwan and I were part of that, and I think that's a real reasonable kind of bipartisan effort to come at it from both sides. And I think if you look at the right and the left and the reasonable minds in both parties, you're going to see the vast majority of people agreeing with some type of comprehensive immigration reform.
And Gary really talked about this earlier. I don't think the cameras were rolling, but I think part of the issue is the extreme of both parties is what's drowning out the middle. Right, and unfortunately, they're politically motivated enough to actually go out to the polls and vote in primaries and really make people afraid to vote their conscience. And our government is turning over as a result of it, because people are either saying, I can't do this anymore, because some of them are voting for stuff they can't live with, right, just to stay in office. And so it's really hijacking our entire system.
I think that's an important point.
But I think that's where the education again comes in, because if people really knew, one thing that we keep forgetting to mention, you actually touched on it, the 10-year bar. We've got people, I would guess that out of the 11 million, there's maybe 1, 2, 3 million people who are eligible for an immigrant visa, can't adjust status here. If they go to the consulate, they trigger a 10-year bar, and they don't have a way of getting a waiver.
Yeah, so
That's crazy.
just gotcha.
That's crazy.
Well, and that's the problem, and we're rapidly running out of time. But I think that the group at Dallas has come up with a lot of really interesting ideas and solutions. Part of the problem is people just need to learn how to talk. That is our leadership. If our leadership in Washington could talk like this panel, we could solve the immigration problem today.
And
Correct?
listen.
Yes.
More
I agree with
talk
that.
and
I do
listen.
too. I think
Absolutely.
we
So-
could reach a
Consensus.
consensus,
Exactly.
and agree.
So Geoffrey Hoffman from U of H Immigration Clinic, thank you. Charles Foster, as always, you're one of the preeminent experts on immigration in the country, and obviously you taught Magali everything you know. And Dallas, it was a pleasure having you on the show this week.
Absolutely.
I enjoyed
We
it.
had a good time.
We'll be back next week with another interesting topic and a number of great guests on Red, White, and Blue.